So we're looking at the introduction from 1865 to 1914, and we talked about the other day how this was just at the end of the Civil War. The introduction talks to you about how 620,000 Americans died, roughly 360,000 Union, 260,000 Confederate. And then, so there was a lot of literature written to comfort people and to help them understand how to face this death. There was a lot of memorializing of the fallen soldiers. And then we had to pick the country back up again, put it together in a period called Reconstruction, right? And just before he died, Abraham Lincoln, this is on page 4, says, "We must simply begin with and mold from disorganized and discordant elements. Nor is it a small additional embarrassment that we, the loyal people, differ among ourselves as to the mode, manner, and means of reconstruction." So there was a lot of work to do. Did you know that Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, was against all of the civil rights improvements that had just been gained? And so for a while there was a lot of uproar on the Capitol Hill until Grant became president and everything got to go into place and the laws were working pretty well. There was the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that accommodated for public services and desegregation. There were African Americans who were elected to Congress throughout the country. And then what happened? There was something called the Compromise of 1877, which began the withdrawal of troops from the South, which then enabled the beginning of the Jim Crow laws and poll taxing and literacy tests, which rolled back all of the legal advances that the country had made in terms of equality between, at this point, blacks and whites in America, those who had been enslaved and were free. So were there all these roadblocks put in to the state legislatures to prevent voting and prevent enfranchisement, and it worked for quite a while. At this point, unfortunately, the national imagination gets a little sidetracked reading the memoirs of the great soldiers, so that we are not reading a lot of protest against the Jim Crow laws. We're not writing a lot of protests in the same way you think the abolitionists would continue, or the women's rights people would continue. They got sidetracked. The most popular text at this time was Grant's memoirs during the war. You begin to see some, in addition to the war tales like Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, you begin to see some publishing of African Americans that began with the plantation myth, with Uncle Remus's stories. But always there's something going on that I'm going to briefly introduce you to called signifying in African American literature, in which, even though it might look to reinforce some racist beliefs, going back to Africa, the writing style is an undermining. If you know what to look for, it undermines the mainstream culture, and it undermines the forces that are seeking to reestablish the inequality that was before the Civil War. So you always should look for that, even if it looks like, once we get into it, simple, straightforward, kind of re-romanticizing of the American South. So we'll work on that, and that'll be fun to look at. At the same time that we were going through the Jim Crow laws and trying to grow beyond that, we had westward expansion. So on page 8 of your textbook, it looks at the Homestead Act of 1862, where you could go out and pretty much be given land. And then we had the Pacific Railroad Act, where we have railroads going out. And I said to you that at least in this section of American literature, we weren't going to be killing Indians or Native Americans, but it's kind of not true. Because with this concept of manifest destiny, which is that it was the European Americans' right to settle all of the land between here and the Pacific, we take Texas, we take California from Mexico, and we make it America. And that is not peacefully done. We have the Mexican War in 1848. And so we have a lot of colonization that is glossed over in American history. This introduction does a really good job of telling you about early Mexican-American writers who were protesting and who were at least letting you know the context of our settlement of the West, and that there were people there before we got there, and it required war. Around this time, this is 1876, we have the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is the last big fight with the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne, where they are pretty much massacred. So there is, that story continues into this part of American literature. We begin to learn more about the process of assimilation, so that Native American children were sent to assimilation school, forced to speak English, forbidden to speak their native tongues, and basically made like Europeans. At the same time, we have immigration coming from all over the place, and France gives us the Statue of Liberty, which was called the Liberty Enlightening the World. It was supposed to be about enlightenment as well, but it began to be focusing on liberty. And we begin to have sort of a limit, even at the same time we put the Statue of Liberty up and we get the quote from Lazarus that says, "Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry," all of that. We have things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we begin to worry about who should be allowed into the country and who should not. And that becomes to be a racially charged question early on. Now we're still continuing the immigration concerns, but then it was about Chinese exclusion. We began to see a lot of union activity in cities like Chicago, the great big industrialized place where so many African Americans had gone up in the Great Migration. But then we're really concerned with labor laws. Upton Sinclair exposes labor problems and cleanliness problems in factories in his text, The Jungle. And it's about corrupt politicians. Stories about Chicago become almost synonymous with corrupt politics and union work. And then we do it again. In 1893, we deposed the Queen of Hawaii, and in 1898, we annex Hawaii. So we depose the Queen and we annex Hawaii. We do it again in the Philippines. In the Philippine-American War of 1899 through 1902. President McKinley argued that the Philippines were unfit for self-government and there was nothing left for us to do but take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. So there's a lot of colonization going on. This is a period in which America goes out and just grabs a lot of lands and says, okay, this is ours. At the same time, there's innovation in technology and an expansion of the literary marketplace. This is where the term the bestseller begins to arise around 1895. Poetry gets a diminished role, and novels and short stories become very popular. Few people read Walt Whitman. They look for short, simple poetry. Dickinson comes out and is well received, but not as well received as some of the more simplistic sort of school poets. Not as complex. Paul Laurence Dunbar gets some play and gets some reading, which he's one of the first serious African American poets. William Cullen Bryant says that poetry may get printed in newspapers, but no man makes money by it for the simple reason that nobody cares a fig for it. So we begin to have a, sort of a trend of genres, which I'll try to show you throughout the different time periods. Novels become very, very popular. And we see Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. It's really showing us Southwestern humor. He's one of our first literary celebrities. Jack London's Call of the Wild, so we're interested in nature, we're interested in settlement, but we're really interested in local color as well, which the introduction gets to in more detail as it goes on. There is a conflict between what are called dime novels, which are very quickly written, very cheap novels, and more high literature of novelists who take themselves more seriously. And unfortunately, many of the dime novelists were women. And so you have people like Hawthorne complaining about what he calls the mobs of scribbling women, and other people talking about hysterical women writers, which we'll get to in the American context, in contrast to serious writers. So there's definitely some sexism going on in the genre preferences, which I'll point out to you, and we can talk about section by section. There begins to be one of the tensions that we'll look at throughout the semester, which is the tension between notions of American unity, what it means to be American, what Americans are like, and the celebration of diversity. So as you're looking at the introduction, look at how that tension begins to arise. So you have, again, the Spanish-American War. We have another war about diversity. They talk about the loss of American innocence a lot at the same time that they talk about the influx of new kinds of people. So there is a rhetoric that begins where we mourn what was sort of a one kind of American in a kind of patriotic zeal in the face of all these different kinds of Americans seeking voice, seeking print, seeking publication. And so it's a false binary between American patriotism and unity versus diversity, but you'll see it cropping up, so look for it. And that is the end of the first